This is a Triumph Tiger 900 Rally. Normally when I do bike reviews, I like to sit down, write a script and kind of put my thoughts out in a journalistic manner, but I feel like changing it up. So this time, I'm just gonna go ride, film what happens along the way and tell you the story of what this bike is like to ride. It should be a good time. Hopefully you enjoy it.
Chilly out today. Tuck in behind this screen. We are on brand new tyres, which is why I am a little bit steady away. The Triumph Tiger 800 was a bike with a really interesting engine. The triple had a bunch of good things going for it and a bunch of things that kind of left you wanting. It had great fueling and it had a really linear, easy power delivery, but it had a really flat torque curve and it didn't make good progress unless you were really high in the revs. However, the Tiger 900 is not that engine. On the road, the thing that it's gained that makes it much better for me is it's gained some low down torque, which means I can sit lower in the revs, I can run whatever gear I want, it kind of doesn't matter, and it rides really, really well as a result. When you roll on from low in the RPM, sub 4,000, it pulls hard, and if you twist the throttle a long way, it will pull quickly through the rev range to the higher part of the power. As a result, I think it's a much more enjoyable bike to ride. It's genuinely lovely, and the beauty of that changing characteristic in the engine, combined with how good Triumph are at fueling a bike, and how smooth the triple engine is, and how easy it is to keep it low in the revs, make for a great off-road engine and a great engine for riding low-speed technical stuff.
Just stopped for lunch, finished lunch, it was good. Now we're gonna go and find our first off-road trails of the day.
Just after lunch, having ridden this bike on the road for 50 or 60 miles, I've added some compression to the fork. It's a single function fork, so compression on one side, rebound on the other. And so I added 4 clicks of compression to the forks because a little bit the front end feels mushy in standard trim. So on the road, when you brake or you're going over bumps, you don't really feel anything. It's kind of comfortable, a little bit of lack of feeling, so I'm hoping that a little bit more compression will help it hold up in the stroke a little bit better and provide a tiny bit more feedback on what the front wheel is actually doing. We're in... Oh, apparently I can't select off-road mode. Who knew? Interesting things going on with this Triumph. Firstly, suspension clearly is pretty good. I'm pretty comfortable on it out the box, but oh, scrub. It's still mushy. Traction control is also getting in the way. That is irritating. As does that cylinder head. when it comes to road riding and handling, this Triumph is really good. We're on adventure tyres at the moment, so Metzler Karoo 3s, because obviously we've been riding quite a lot of off-road as well. And there's definitely always that transition when you change to a tyre like that you have to get used to. But I think in general, the Triumph handles fantastically on the road. It's really nice, it's really confidence inspiring. It's got a really progressive tip in, it holds a line fantastically well. Like, I think that's a really big thing. I put a bit of effort into counter steering to get it over, really not a lot. But then once it's over, my hands are so light on the handlebars. There's no effort to keep it turning, to keep it riding nice. It has good feedback from the chassis, especially once I got the suspension balance a little bit more dialed in. I put it a little bit more on its nose by stiffening the rear up. I stiffened the fork up a tiny bit through the clickers to give it a little bit more firmness, a little bit more feedback from the front wheel. And it feels great. Like, I'm really comfortable on it. It's really confidence inspiring. It's very easy to ride. And as a result, it's really enjoyable. When you combine that, the chassis, with the engine and the suspension, you have a really complete road package. It's a little bit greasy here on the road. It'd be terrible to have a bit of GoPro of me sliding into a bank, wouldn't it? Yeah, so you end up with this really complete package. On the road, this is a lovely bike. If you're gonna buy it and 90% of your riding is gonna be on the road, 100% of your riding is gonna be on the road, this is a brilliant bike. You will absolutely love it. It's not mind-melting like some of the more powerful adventure bikes, but what it is a really good street bike.
Just stopped, beautiful spot, amazing road. We're going to try and turn the handlebar clamps around on the Triumph to get them forward a little bit, to make it a little bit nicer to ride. Like, the standing position's a tiny bit cramped at the moment. We'll see how it goes.
See, that is the daddy, isn't it? Look at that. Am I going to speak too soon here?
So even though they look reversible, the handlebar clamps on the Triumph aren't reversible. Everything lines up when you spin them around to move the handlebars forwards, but the holes at the back of the triple clamp don't have any threads in them, so you can't bolt the handlebar clamps down. Kind of just meant we had to live with the handlebars in the standard position and get used to it.
It's a bit more of a hole than I thought there. Ran out of momentum and talent.
I can do this better than you could. Woo! Whoa! That's the answer. Now I've got wet feet. Waterproof boots are great until you go over the top of them.
When it comes to the chassis riding off-road, with the Tiger 900, I don't think it's a cut and dry thing of it's a great chassis or a terrible chassis. There's definitely some moments where I really trust it and some moments where it confuses me a little bit. If you've ever ridden an 800 GS, this is an 800 GS style feeling bike, but with much better suspension and a little bit more consistency. Triumph have done a pretty good job of shedding weight on the new bike. The new one comes in at about 197 plus liquids. I don't quite know what that figure is, but it's not anywhere near as heavy as some of the other adventure bikes it's going up against. It generally works out about 20 kilos lighter than an F850 GS, a little bit more again lighter than an Africa Twin, but slightly heavier than a 790 Adventure or a Tenere 700. When you ride, you can definitely feel that. Now, the chassis and the way it handles is a bit of a combination of the fact that the suspension is plush and adventure-y, and a little bit the fact that it's an adventure bike with some hefty weight behind it. Now, when the trail is smooth, I think the Triumph is really easy to be precise on. It's really easy to put the wheels exactly where you want to, and it does nothing weird. When the trail gets a bit more excited,
There's a few more bumps and rocks and a little bit more transition through the stroke of the suspension. The chassis becomes a bit more cumbersome. Now, I mostly think that that is a suspension setup decision rather than a chassis decision. Generally off-road, I think it's a really neutral bike. It's really, really predictable to ride. And when you're talking about the chassis of a bike, as long as it's predictable, I think you can ride around most of the things it does. Now, the Triumph doesn't do anything weird. It's really consistent, makes it really easy to ride. In terms of how it handles, I think it handles really well. Left to right, through corners and trying to be precise on the trail. It's not incredibly nimble, it's not sluggish, it's kind of a middle ground thing. And a lot of the limitations of that come from the suspension more than anything else. There's a couple of tiny bits that are odd, I think is probably the word. The standing position is a tiny bit upright. So the handlebars are a little bit close to the foot pegs. Maybe the foot pegs are a little bit forwards, tiny bit hard to tell. And we tried to rectify that by turning the handlebars around. Obviously that didn't work very well. So kind of have to just live with it. Now, the other thing that maybe makes this feel a tiny bit weird is the foot pegs are super grippy and I really like them, but they're not very wide. And because they're not very wide, it makes you stand a bit far forward on them. And when you stand a bit far forward, it puts you a tiny bit more upright. It was a little bit just, I kind of got used to it, but it never felt perfectly right. The other thing that I noticed when you stand up off-road is that there's some points on the bike that you catch quite a lot. One of them is the right-hand case. It sticks out a long way. There's not a lot they can do about that without redesigning the engine. And you catch your foot on it a lot, catch your shin on it a lot, because when you hit a bump, if you go forwards at all with your knees, which you probably shouldn't, you hit the case. The other thing that happens is the plastic panels have got a bit of a ridge in them, and I hit my knee on them a lot. I've got a bruised knee. I didn't really notice it while I was riding, but I've got a bruised knee, so it's there. That clear direction that Triumph have taken with the suspension to have a nice balance of comfort versus performance on road is exactly the same off-road. Like, they have clearly baked into this bike an idea that there should be a degree of comfort to it, unlike the KTM 790R, where predominantly the base setting is to deal with big hits. This bike is not like that. What it is a really nice all-round adventure bike off-road.
The Triumph is set up with a general amount of comfort into the suspension, so the first part of the stroke especially is very plush and soft. It means the front wheel tracks the ground really well. Now, when we ride adventure bikes, I don't know what it's like for other people, but for us in Wales, a lot of our adventure riding is quite rocky. And if you have the fork a little bit too harsh, it skips around a lot. The sensitivity of the Triumph fork is very nice. It's plush and soft, and the front wheel tracks the ground very well, which means you get quite a lot of grip and a lot of consistent performance, especially on trails like this, typical adventure bike trails where you have some rocks in the ground. It's nice and predictable. I'm quite confident in these small rocks to just let it do its thing and trust that it's gonna be okay. Now, when I first started out on the Triumph, I was actually, ooh, puddle, deeper than it looks, was actually a little bit, what a pretty view, by the way. Was actually a little bit weird. I didn't like it. It was so soft at the bottom part of the stroke that it was a bit mushy feeling, and it was quite difficult to have any feedback of the ground. Now, there's always a balance with suspension where I, on a personal level, like to have some idea of what the front wheel is doing. If the suspension is too soft, you can't feel the terrain, you can't feel the grip, you don't know when it slides. It's a bit inconsistent and uncomfortable feeling. And so I added quite a lot of compression on the clickers up until the point it got harsh, and then went backwards a little bit, and then it feels really good. I would say that the adjustment on the suspension doesn't do much very quickly, so you have to turn it quite a few times to get much response, but it works. The other characteristic you have when it moves a lot is that the front wheel comes back quite quickly. When it comes back quite quickly, it upsets the balance. It doesn't really feel that good. So if you can slow everything down a little bit, it makes a really nice fork. Ultimately, what I managed to get it to do was be still quite sensitive to those small bumps and soft, without blowing through the stroke too quickly. So when you hit something a bit harder, it was okay. Now, if you override this bike and you hit a bump too hard, it does blow through the stroke, it does go metal to metal. It's a little bit more like a traditional adventure bike than something like a 790 Adventure, but it's still pretty good. Like, I was still pretty comfortable with it. The biggest issue when you blow through the stroke really hard for me is that it comes back really quickly as well. It doesn't have enough rebound control in the fork itself to deal with that. So there was one point where I hit a root really hard and the fork bounced back a long way really fast and it threw the bike completely offline. It's okay. It's not amazing, but it's a really nice all-round balance. Jack of all trades, master of none kind of saying. When it comes to the shock, I think things are a little bit more rudimental. We don't have any control over it other than the rebound adjuster, no compression adjustment, and the shock is okay. It's simple, it's not particularly sensitive, it's not got particularly good control over the stroke. The rebound being fast-ish isn't that much of an issue, you can control it with the clicker. But the one thing that was weird is if you hit a bump quite hard, it almost feels like in the linkage or the shock design or something, there's an anti-blow through the stroke device, but the rear wheel kind of stops and it stops the bike a little bit. So if you hit something hard, you get this thing where the bike stops a bit quicker than you expect it to rather than just pushing through the ground. Again, it's an adventure bike, it's not a dirt bike. I'm not expecting it to be wonderful. It does the job. It's just not amazing.
Okay, this is going to be a test of any adventure bike, I think. Ooh, girl! Right in. No messing about. So, as you can see, the Triumph is pretty damn good in that situation. It's real good with the engine staying low in the RPM if you're gentle with it. I'm about to make a mug of myself. Yes. This is slippery and rooty. Oh, bit too much rebound off that root. My God, it's starting to rain. I think we might have to stop and waterproof up before it gets too grim.
Last night we stayed in a kind of caravan cabin-y sort of thing. It was pretty wet when we got in. The cameras were soaked, everything was soaked. So I didn't really film anything, but now we're dry. It's time to go ride again.
Welcome to another beautiful morning. Clouds are popping, and I am a person that likes to run my fuel mileage right to the bottom. I don't know why, I always have been. We got 8.5 miles to petrol station and 16 miles of range, plenty of room for wiggle. After a good 120 miles on this bike yesterday, I would say, firstly, I feel very comfortable on it. I think this is one of those characteristics, it's a little bit unquantifiable, but sometimes you get on bikes and they're very predictable, and sometimes you get on bikes and they're very unpredictable. And this Triumph, for the most part, falls into the category of being very predictable. One of the underlying things that I think is really important with any adventure bike, for me, when you use it in a kind of real-world adventure scenario, is the manageability of the bike. Some adventure bikes are incredibly capable machines, but their low-speed riding comfort is not very good. They're not easy to control at low speed. They're not easy to deliver the power on, the clutch is hard to feel what's going on, and the balance is a little bit off. And generally for me, that's what makes a bike feel big. When it's hard to manage at low speed, it accentuates the weight of a bike dramatically. It accentuates the height of a bike dramatically. So when you have really squishy suspension with a clutch that's kind of vague and hard to judge where the bite point is, and you end up having to rev it quite a lot to feel comfortable doing hill starts or U-turns, all of a sudden the whole process is a bit more stressful than it needs to be. And this Triumph is not that bike. It is, I personally feel, incredibly manageable.
The clutch and the way that it delivers power to the back wheel and how easy and predictable that is translates massively into how easy the Triumph is to ride in tricky situations. So when you need to turn around in a car park or you want to pull away on a hill, the directness of it and the way the engine delivers power means it doesn't stall very easy and you've got a lot of latitude with the clutch. It's a small thing, but for me it makes using this bike in adventure style scenarios where you don't have a lot of control or repetition of the environment, makes it very easy to use. Likewise, the way the engine delivers power off the bottom is very gentle. And so those three things together make it a quite easy bike to ride. The only limit to that for me with the Triumph is that there's a slight lack of steering lock. Now on the old bike, that steering lock problem was much bigger. It's better than it was, but it still, I think, could be a little bit better. It has a tendency to sometimes catch you off guard a little bit and catch you out, which upsets the balance of the bike a tiny bit when you're doing things like tight U-turns. However, generally, I think it's pretty easy to ride.
Well, this is classic Wales. This is the fuel station. No. You don't have any... Alright, cool. It's alright. That'll be a no. We'll try it. We can get around that, I think.
When it comes to the electronics package, Triumph have really brought the Tiger 900 into the future. They had to a little bit because of new Euro regulations, but also because everybody else has. We've got a TFT screen, electronic throttle, and all the good stuff that comes with that. In fact, I think the Triumphs as a whole have one of the most complete packages of extras you can add to your bike. You can go the cruise control, heated seats, heated grips. And I think one of the things that Triumph have done really, really well with their technology and the finish of all of that stuff is how well integrated it is. The switchgear is very nice, the TFT works fantastically well, it's pretty simple, and the heated grip switch is actually in the grip. I don't want to have to buy a new one because that probably won't be cheap, but I really like the way it works. Now, whenever you're talking about technology, what becomes frustrating with it when it starts to grow and develop is when it doesn't work as well as when it wasn't there. However, for the most part, the Triumph is really good. I'm really impressed with the ABS. It's fantastic, it doesn't interfere. When it does interfere because you've done something wrong, it's quite progressive. But even riding it off-road, I've had the ABS on the front the whole time and I've never had a problem with it. The traction control, maybe not quite the same. It definitely cuts in a little bit earlier and a little bit more abruptly than I'd like it to. I generally find myself riding off-road with it off and just trusting my own skill. But on the road, it works really well too. The only little snags I have are the fluidity of how some of the systems work. One little thing that you get over pretty quickly, but the mode button just has an M written on it. So until you figure out it's the mode button, you're guessing a little bit. It could be a little bit clearer. But really my biggest kind of flow issue with the electronics is the changing of the modes. So quite often, especially in the UK when we're riding, we switch between sections of tarmac and off-road a lot. And it's really nice to be able to change the mode without really having to stop, to just push the mode button, be in off-road mode, know that the ABS and the traction control are fit for what you're about to ride into and not have to worry about it. But with the Triumph, to do that, I have to turn the bike off and have to be stationary. Then I can change the mode and then we can go again. And every time you want to go out of off-road mode, you have to do the same thing. Little snag, not like that big of an issue, but it is irritating over time. The other thing that I wish was a little bit different was when you turn it off, if you turn it back on and you're in off-road mode before, you have to then reselect off-road mode. It reminds you to do this, but you have to do it. I get why they've done that. Like, it's an obvious safety feature so that someone doesn't forget and then ride down the road with the wrong ABS mode on and have a crash. But I put it in off-road mode. I know it's in off-road mode. I can figure that bit out for myself.
The panic was strong. Well, that was a wild wheelie. I think this Triumph Tiger 900 is bang in the middle of everything. It's not the kind of bike that's excelling or super focused in one direction, but it is very, very capable of all of the different elements of adventure bike riding. If you needed to ride down the motorway with the screen in the high position, the wind protection feels really good and it's comfortable, and the engine is geared well enough to pull motorway speeds all day without overworking. We've got cruise control and it's comfortable. I can ride this bike all day and I think it's really comfortable. This one, I do believe, has the comfort seat. And when you want to turn off-road, it works fantastically well. It's not perfect. There's little bits that definitely feel like a compromise, but the more I ride it, the more I learn what those are, and I can ride around those small bits, the more complete this bike feels, and the more comfortable I am to do what I want to do with it.
I'm back home. It's kind of the test over. Feels like normally I do like a bit of a summary thing here. With the Tiger 900, when it comes to talking about its abilities in context of an adventure bike and against the other bikes that are theoretically in this class of mid-sized adventure bike, the Triumph is a really convoluted bike. It does everything very well, nothing exceptionally, but that is kind of the point of an adventure bike. And at the end, as we've gone through this test and I've talked about the various elements of the bike and what it's like to ride, there's no one thing where I stand there and I'm super excited about its ability, but as an adventure bike, I think it's very easy to ride. And when bikes are easy to ride, I think they're fun because they let you do more. It's a very good road bike. It's easy to ride quickly on the road. It's effortless. It's quite effortless to ride a really long way. And because of the way the engine is, it's quite effortless to ride technically off-road, which means it's a very fun bike. It is not a KTM 790 Adventure R. If you're looking for that bike, but with a Triumph badge, you would need to sort the suspension out a bit more. It's not quite there, but if you look at the class that this bike is up against, we're talking maybe the entry-level Africa Twin, an 850 GS, that kind of bike, that kind of price range, this Triumph is really good. Like, it's really good. And I think Triumph have done an exceptional job. It's very well-rounded and it's very well finished. Generally, when I look at it, it feels like the kind of level that you would expect from someone like BMW. The switchgear is beautiful, the TFT is beautiful, the clutch and the throttle and the suspension, it's all very well done. And Triumph need a big round of applause for that.
Plus that version, without any of the kind of fancy protection and no heated seat, is about £11,500. It's quite difficult to quantify whether this bike is going to be the right bike for you, but if you're looking for an all-round adventure bike or you're looking for a really nice street bike, it's great. Buy one. You'll love it, you won't regret it. I can't imagine that there's too much about that bike that's going to upset anyone. It's just a really good bike. And the brakes look really good. Like, that's a nice touch. Well done, Triumph. To end this video, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone that supports me on Patreon. It makes a massive difference to what I can do and the videos that I can make. And I've got some really cool things going on there. I made some big changes to the way I'm producing videos and what I'm producing. And a lot of that content is found on Patreon first. If it's not found on Patreon first, it's because it's only found on Patreon. So take a look for me, let me know what you think. And if you've got any questions about this bike, drop them in the comments, because I will be doing a live Q&A. If you're watching this video 2 years after it came out, it's probably live. But ask your questions, I'll answer them, and otherwise remember, life's better when you're riding.